Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. I'm Abram Kielsmeyer-Jones. This is Translation Notes, and we're going to study Mark 15:21 through 24 today. This series takes us through the lexical and grammatical questions that come up when we translate the Greek text of Mark into English. I note that this particular series is more focused on translating than it is on accordance features per se. Although we will be in accordance the whole time. If you are interested in a more feature-based approach to learning accordance, you can go to the help menu up at the top of your app. When you've got the app open, go to the help menu, and there's a webinar section there which has lots of pre-recorded webinars covering just about every feature that exists in the app. Today we'll be looking at these 4 verses, moving from Greek to English and using accordance to help us do that. We are recording today's session, so if you are watching on a recording and want to access the handout, you can get it at tinyurl.com/Mark Translation Notes. Everything is there from this series. You can also email me at abramkj@accordancebible.com. And if you're here live, a warm welcome to you. This handout is also available in the GoToWebinar control panel. And if you're here live now, or if you registered for it, you'll get an email with access to the recording and the handout later on as well. I think that covers it. If you've got any questions or comments, you can use the questions box to type it in. That's essentially a one-way typed chat. Questions come my way and comments. You can send those at any time and I'll respond. And I will pause from time to time to make sure that we're caught up on those. Last week, we got through verse 20, and I just want to pick up there. This is in a lighter font. It's gray, just to show that we covered it already. But last week, we looked at Jesus being abused, and the particular scene closes with, "And after they mocked him, they took off the purple clothing or cloak and put his own clothes back on him. Then they led him away in order to crucify him." And I noted that this kai exagusin auton hinastaurososin auton could be considered to go with verse 21 and following, or you could read it as a concluding statement to the verses that come ahead. It's one of those interesting verses where in a lot of translations, you'll get a paragraph break in the middle of a verse, which is often a good indication that you really could understand it multiple ways. You'll see here in the NA28 text that I've got open, I have it set to display by verse, but even here we've got the paragraph marker mid-verse. So do with that what you will. I think wherever you decide this goes, paragraph-wise in your translation, it really does, I think, pretty closely connect the two passages. So we are now at the scene of the crucifixion itself. And I just want to note that when we talk about the crucifixion as an event, there is a crucifying act that happens, and it's surrounded by what leads up to it and what follows it. So I just want to note here, and I'll just do this in English with the NET Bible, which is right here in my parallel pane. There we go. So this heading is properly named the crucifixion here in the NET Bible. Before we had Jesus is mocked, I noted that in many passages are headed this way. I think that crucially leaves out the fact that he was not just verbally abused, but physically abused. That's all in leading up to the crucifixion. And we even had this interaction with Pilate. And then after what we studied today, so skipping way ahead, we're going to get more about the crucifixion here. And so when we talk about the crucifixion passage, I mean, you really could think of it as all of chapter 15. And in fact, Jesus's death itself isn't even narrated until verse 33. So that's all part of the same story. And at the same time, as we're going to see today, I'm just going to jump ahead here. We've got these three key words, kai stau rusin auton, and they crucified him. So this is also the crucifixion. I mean, if we were to say, where is the crucifixion in Mark located? The answer is Mark 15, and I think the answer is also Mark 15:24. There's a kind of narrowing in right there on the crucifying itself. And we'll look at this more when we get to the passage. But I say all that to set the stage. We're now in the crucifixion scene in that sense, kind of zoomed in. And so we'll start with verse 21. I'm going to move back over to Accordance for this. And I'm going to close the English. All right, verse 21. Kai angeruusin paraganta tina simona kurenanan erkamenan ap agru tan patera Alexandru kai rufu hina are tan staran autu. And if we go left to right, we get, and they compelled or forced, or you'll see conscripted into service a passerby, someone who was para ago-ing, so he was going by, one or a certain Simon of Cyrene, coming from the field or a field, or the country, coming from a country or the countryside, the father of Alexander and Rufus, in order that he might carry his cross. Autu referring to Jesus. Here's my translation. And they, and I just put the soldiers, I'll fix that typo, and you'll get a cleaned up handout by the time you're watching this recording or by the time you get the email follow-up later today. And they, the soldiers, forced a certain passerby to carry his cross. Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, who was coming from the country. There are multiple ways to do the word order here, and I want to start with that. If you follow the Greek left to right as closely as possible, it would sound like this. And they forced a certain passerby, Simon of Cyrene, coming from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. In English, when we think about the relationship between these different phrases, we would more naturally say Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was coming from the country. But we also have, they forced him to carry his cross. So these are like nested subordinate clauses. Let me pull up a diagram tool just so we can get a visual on that. So we've got Simon the Cyrene, and that equals here means these are all the same person. So a passerby is one description. Simon, the Cyrenian, Simon of Cyrene, or Simon the Cyrenian, and the father. So all of these are who he is, and then the passerby has some modifiers, and the father has some modifiers, and that's all one person who is on the receiving end of this being forced to carry the cross. So the question is, how do we order the words in English? And I think the answer is not this way. So I've tried to make it as natural as possible. They forced a certain passerby to carry his cross, colon, and, or you could say, and the passerby was, and then you get the person kind of separated out structurally from the sentence so that these modifiers don't lose the reader by the time they get to the action. This is one way to do it. It's certainly not the only way. Different translations have different approaches. I'm just going to open up via live click. Oops, let me close that. Do live click and I'll make sure I've got, okay, this is not what I want. Let's try this again. I'm gonna go back to my Greek text, live click, the gear icon shows up. I want verse lookup, And I'm going to go to verse 21, and you'll see now here the Berean Bible fronts Simon of Cyrene as the subject, and he was passing by, and the soldiers forced him. You've got also the Common English Bible with Simon up at the top of the sentence. Here, they forced as the Greek begins. But even with those different orders, you're going to get different order of the rest of the clauses. So you might just take some time to look through this. Like here's the King James, and they compel one Simon, a Cyrenian, who passed by, coming out of the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus. So they follow the word order pretty closely. But again, I think we just get lost in these phrases this way. So just take some time to think about that. You're not at all changing the meaning of the text. In fact, one of the goals of translation is to make it make sense in the target language. So this gives us a good case study in how to arrange word order in a way that makes sense. Another option is that you chop it up into individual sentences, and that is a suggestion that comes from as a possibility from the UBS Translator's Handbook. And they go into detail on this issue. They say between the object, a passerby, and the verb expression with which it goes, namely to carry his cross, it is often quite impossible to interpose so much of what is explanatory. So, in other words, we've got this angaruusin, and they compelled, and that thought is not complete until, well, what do they compel this person to do? Well, it's hina are. So you get all this intervening material as the object of this verb, but this verb, it's not quite a split infinitive because this is subjunctive, but we understand the subjunctive as an infinitive. So it really is in English like a split infinitive. So we just want to be mindful of that. In Greek, you can have intervening material even within two words, even between two words that are tightly linked to each other. So we just note that angaruusin is not complete until hina are. This is the subjunctive, and so it would be more woodenly something like, and they force, they compel in order that he would carry the cross. But in English, we would give the subjunctive over to the infinitive. They forced him to carry the cross. So the Translator's Handbook then gives us basically a list of all that intervening material. The man's name, what he's doing, passing by, coming from the country, his relationship to his sons, and you get here, because of the syntactic difficulties imposed by this type of arrangement, some languages, of which one is English, require considerable recasting of the word order, and they give an option here. Let's stick with this verb for just a moment, angaruusin, from angaruo. BDAG gives us, they pressed him into service to carry the cross. That's how they translate angaruusin hina are tan staran autu. We could triple click that word. Oops, let me turn off live click. Triple clicking will be easier. And it's got this word requisition or press into service, so force, compel. The image here is of soldiers who basically have the right to ask passersby to do whatever they want to. And so this force is fine, but if you wanted the military connotation, something like conscripted could be in there. Compelled, you might see in another translation. But Simon of Cyrene is not exactly volunteering for this opportunity. I mean, he is going to do it, but there is this forcing or pressing into service, which is very much in line with the soldiers' behavior so far in how they have treated Jesus. They are not respecters of other person's bodily autonomy or agency. They're just doing what they want to do in the way that they want to do it and making others follow their wishes. That's all in this word. And again, it's very much keeping with their character as we've seen them already. I'll just note this from France, and then we'll pause and see if there are questions or comments that folks have. R.T. France, in his New International Greek Testament Commentary, says that Simon is not otherwise known. And then I love these asides you get, and you really have to read a lot of France to get to one of these, but he'll say, why should he be? I just think, well, yeah, I mean, why would I know who Simon of Cyrene is? He's a little bit of sense of humor here. But Mark's apparently unnecessary comment, France says, that his sons were Alexander and Rufus, suggests that these two men were known to Mark's readers because they and maybe their father had become Christians, perhaps as a result of this involuntary involvement in the story of Jesus. So in other words, this is just a close reading of the text, and then he's speculating a little bit, but when you say Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, it's as if you're anticipating a response of, who is Simon of Cyrene? Oh yeah, he's the dad of Alexander and Rufus. Oh yeah, that guy. I know those kids. He's their father. So I think that's a pretty safe interpretation, that if you're naming somebody else to describe a person, that somebody else is likely known to the original audience and first listeners and readers of this text. We don't know that for sure, but I think that's a pretty safe reading. Now, France goes farther with this and talks about the possibility of Simon taking up the cross, and that verb iro is used in Mark 8:34. France notes this idea of symbolically taking up a cross to follow Jesus. He says he thinks it's inappropriate to suggest that this taking up the cross symbolizes discipleship, but he's not ruling it out. And either way, he notes that Mark's readers may have found this to be a striking illustration, he says, of the costly identification with the suffering Messiah, which Jesus earlier saying had called for. So he is literally carrying his cross, and this is a point of interpretation. It's a question to explore further. How does this verse relate to Mark 8:34? I don't think that needs to come up in translation at all, but it is interesting to note that we have a literal carrying of the cross here. So does that strike a chord with the readers then and now? Certainly now it does, if you've heard that phrase or used it, but you can decide what to do with that in terms of the interpretation. So again, Mark 15:21, and they, the soldiers, forced a certain passerby to carry his cross, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, who was coming from the country. Let's see what questions and comments you've got. And I didn't cover every single word here. The most conspicuous word here that I didn't cover is tan stauron, the cross. That would be worthy of a word study and some historical background in terms of what that looked like and how heavy it was and all these sorts of questions. But let me see what you've got on this verse, and then we'll move on. Here's a good, yeah, let me put this in the chat and I'll read it out loud. Somebody says, interesting section where an indefinite entity becomes robustly identified into a definite person before the main verb occurs. It seems to me Mark is being emphatic on this identity point. That's a great observation. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, and it's funny, this tina, it is indefinite. So I'm glad you point that out. Even though the word certain doesn't sound very indefinite, and that might not be the translation you want to go with, but it is, it's kind of like saying a certain somebody, but it's this randomness of the passerby, I think, to the soldiers is where that starts. That's what the tina gives us. But yes, well pointed out. We in the end get a number of modifiers of this guy. So, you know, I think probably what you could do, well, your commentaries will tell you about this, but you could even just search Simon of Cyrene, just copy that phrase and go to a research tab and see what you've got all through your library on Simon, just to see, you know, what's the interpretive tradition that built up around him. I think there's a lot there that would be interesting. But yeah, great comment and thank you. Here's another comment. Oh yeah, here's great. Somebody else says a Rufus is mentioned in Romans 16:13 by Paul, where he tells Romans to greet him. As Mark seems to target Romans, this is an interesting coincidence. And any time you see a word, we haven't really done this as much, but any word I think is worth just, I mean, any name, rather a proper name is worth a word search. And you know, Alexander's not going to really, I mean, you've got so many Alexanders, but maybe something like Rufus. There's Romans 16:13. And so the nice thing about this is if this is the same Rufus, which your commentators will give you opinions about, now you've got another set of commentaries to look at, namely all your commentaries in Romans. So you could read commentaries in Mark and in Romans and kind of weigh them together to see, you know, is this the same person? And then Simon the Cyrene, you could search for him as well. But yeah, great connection. Thanks for that. Let's move on to verse 22. Keep the comments and questions coming if you like. So we get a new, do we get another new paragraph here? Yeah, we do. All right, so Kai Ferusin auton epiton galgathan tapon ha estin methermenuamenon chroniu tapas. That is a long word. We've seen it before in Mark. And they led him to the Golgotha place. Although epi, I think two is probably the best. That's one of those prepositions that, I mean, this entry is going to be very long. To or toward. All right, I digress. And they led him, or present tense, and they lead him to the Golgotha place. That is translated, which is translated skull place. It's not very readable like that, but you may still translate it that way. Here's what I've got. Then they led him to the place called Golgotha, which is translated place of the skull, or which is translated into, or which is translated as place of the skull. This called is not here. So you could just render this as they led him to the place Golgotha. And then what Mark wants to do here is to translate this. The Golgotha means skull place. So we get tapon twice here, which is interesting. Here, it seems to be, the first use, it seems to be just the generic, they led him to a place that is Golgotha. But in the second use, and you get it capitalized by the editors of the NA28, and I would think the UBS 5 too, those have the same surface text. You get tapas capitalized here as a place name. It's kind of interesting. So chroniu tapas is the skull place. I don't know if any translations actually translate it as the skull place, the place of a skull, the place of the skull. Oh, I stand corrected. All right, so here's one, skull place. All right, well, I don't really think, I think you could go either way. Yeah, here's skull place. The reason why I would consider the place of the skull over skull place, even if this reads better as skull place to me, is just the consideration that interpreters or translators often have that you may or may not like, which is with a familiar verse or a familiar place name, translators tend to be reluctant to change from something that is kind of commonly known or accepted. Now that may be a practice that you agree with or disagree with, but I think because place of the skull may be known to folks already reading the Bible, I think I would go with that translation. But you do have chroniu tapas. The other consideration, though, is just to look at the syntax here. And you've got tapas is a nominative noun and chroniu is genitive. So really, it's of the skull place or of skull place. So I think another consideration is that genitive there. Which subordinates chroniu to tapas. So maybe even grammatically place of the skull is better. But either way, it is a place name, so whatever you do in English needs to be capitalized. Interesting note from the New English translation, the Latin word for the Greek term kranion is calvaria, from which the English word Calvary is derived. The SIL Exegetical Summary Series asks, why was this place called the place of a skull? And it notes here, just a catalog of different interpretations and translations. It says, Golgotha is a translation of the Aramaic word for skull. The history behind the naming of the site is not documented. Some think the name skull was probably derived from the shape of the bare round hill which resembled a human skull. Executions were performed outside the city on a hill that was named the place of a skull, either because of its skull-like shape or because it was a customary place of execution. So you're getting some repetition there in the commentaries. And then my favorite interpretation, there's no universally accepted explanation, which how many paragraphs have you read in commentaries before that end that way? Or like this, it is possible that both conjectures contain an element of truth. France goes into further detail with Mark and Aramaic. And I think that probably the way to get at this would be to take this word, search for I would go with the lexeme, although maybe you want inflected, although I think those are the same search in Mark anyway. Yeah, so here they are in Mark, 541, 1522, 1534. France gives us 1436, which I am wondering why that's not showing up. Let's just see what 1436 is. Maybe he just says ha estin. Oh, I see. Abba ha pater pantatunata. Okay, so all right, so we've got some Aramaic at play here, Francis saying, but not with this particular word, which is translated. So if you search for this word, these are going to be all the times that Mark says, and in each case, it's ha estin. So ha estin methermenuamenon, which is translated so-and-so. So you get the Aramaic, so talitha kum, we had that way back in Mark 5. We get Golgothan, Aramaic here, and then what it's translated. And then here we get some more Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which is, and then the Greek. So this is in Greek. I mean, these are Greek characters, but it's a Greek transliteration of the Aramaic. And then this is the translation. So transliteration is just bringing the words over, bringing the letters over into the same language. Translation is actually translating it. So that's what Mark's doing here. He's done it before. I find this question really fascinating. Like, why is Mark doing it here and not in other places? And again, this will exceed the scope of the translation. And in the English translation, we just want to preserve what Mark does here. He has his reasons, but I do wonder about them. I think you could search your commentaries for this and see what's the significance of this. I think one thought I've seen is that, like with the Talitha Kum narrative, I'd have to go back and check the notes there, but one thought I've seen is that this is meant to bring a certain vividness to the reader, that it's taking you right there to the language that was spoken. That also raises questions of, did Jesus truly speak Aramaic all the time? Did he speak Aramaic most of the time? What's the relationship between Aramaic and Hebrew? Did he know Greek? Lots of great questions there. And there's actually a decent amount of scholarship, maybe not as much as you would hope, but that for me would be a fun excursus to go on after looking at a verse like this. But France gives us one kind of hypothesis. A place name, he says, does not in itself require quote unquote translation. He says, but the sinister implications of the name clearly entered into Christian understanding of the crucifixion story, and Mark does not want his readers to miss that nuance. So if I were to ask you your first name and ask you what it means, it may be that your name is derived from another language and means something in that language, but you go by your name, not necessarily that meaning. And that's, I think, what France is getting at here. Golgotha can just be called Golgotha. He's naming a place, but France is asking the question, why are we getting this translation here on top of the place name? You don't need to translate a place name. A place name is a place name. And I think his theory here is interesting. Of course, it's interpretation, but he is really wanting to bring out, according to France, this place of the skull. I mean, that sound, you know, in English even, that sounds pretty foreboding. We don't talk about skulls unless they're typically, I mean, you can talk about a skull fracture, but usually when you use the word skull, the word death is not far behind. And according to France, Mark is, I think, maybe alluding to that. So I'll pause there with that verse. It's an interesting verse. It doesn't add a whole lot of information per se to the narrative. It's just where he's going and he's naming it. But I do think it's worth pausing and reflecting on this business of Mark talking about the translation. And you know, you could go further with this too and see other, like John's got it a couple times, Acts has it a couple times, Matthew has it a couple times. This would be an interesting word to explore more. And even what is the role of translation when the writers are doing it themselves already? I mean, we're doing translation, but Mark is also doing some translation. So what do we make of that? I think there's a lot there. All right, let's see what questions and comments you've got on this verse on Golgotha. And by the way, I'll just acknowledge that we have not done anything on location here. I think that would be that, you know, looking this up, you'll get some of this maybe in your lexicons, but you might even just do, like, you can right click from Golgotha in English and do a research search. You could even search it in your graphics tools and try to get some, you know, pictures of where we think this is, and even on a map, where is all this. Again, you don't need to do that for translation per se, but certainly Mark wants us to know where we're going. So in terms of understanding the passage, we do have a fair bit of movement in chapter 15. He's starting out on trial, they're leading him away, they're forcing Simon of Cyrene to carry the cross, and now they bring him to Golgotha, which is where we're going to stay for a little while. Let's see what you've got. Yeah, here's a great, yeah, Mark, so somebody says Mark uses Kai profusely. It confuses the translators using too many unexplained paragraphs in this section. Yeah, that's something I think really to wrestle with here. And you know, we've said before, you can understand it as pleonastic. You can understand it as contrastive, as continuative. You could understand it almost even as a verse marker or a capital letter. But yeah, you've got 17 as Kai, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. And these really stick out the way that this text is presented and versified. Of course, if we go to a manuscript, let's see, I'll just take one at random. If we go to a manuscript, you're gonna, these Kais here would probably be a little bit more welcome in terms of reading and just kind of finding your place. Actually, this has spacing. I think you can change this on these manuscripts. Okay, so if we're looking at a text like this, which we are with a manuscript, those Kais become, I think, a lot more welcome because you kind of get your bearings. But yes, to your point, I agree, and I affirm that in translation that you can get a little bit of Kai translation fatigue. Here's another comment. Someone says, phrase Kai Pharusin auton may refer to Simon and Jesus carrying the cross to the skull place. Let's see. They carried auton. All right, so the way to check that would be auton is masculine singular accusative. Yeah, I mean grammatically that's possible, and they carried it to the that's certainly possible grammatically, because you've got ton stauron, masculine singular accusative. The auton is masculine singular accusative, so that could in theory refer back to that, and the they just isn't really clarified here. I have a note on this somewhere in the handout, but we get a lot of they in this passage. And like here, for example, we'll get to this in a moment, they gave him wine mixed with myrrh. Not really clear who that is, and it's led to different interpretations on who's giving Jesus the wine mixed with myrrh. But yeah, Mark is not exactly clarifying who all this is, so that's an interesting possibility. I had not thought about that. Somebody says, let me put this in the chat, don't we usually refer to locations where things habitually happen as fill in the blank place? Yeah. Here's another comment. Reference the place, location. Some commentators see Golgotha as also being the place where Abraham was planning to offer up Isaac, where Abraham was stopped from offering his son. God did offer his son. It is the hilltop of Moriah. Right. Yeah, again, your commentaries will have good stuff on that. And that, I mean, if you do some research and find yourself convinced along those lines, that is a powerful connection in terms of interpretation and theology and history and interbiblical connection. I mean, there would just be a lot there to explore, as folks have. So that's, yeah, thanks for pointing that out. That's great. All right, let's move on to verse 23. And as I just mentioned, we get this edidun, which is a verb that has a they encoded in it, third person plural, subject and verb, all wrapped up in one word in Greek, which is great, but it doesn't tell us who it is. My suggestion is just to keep any potential ambiguity here, keep it as they in translation. You may want to tease it out. Either way, it would be good for understanding to know who it is, if we can. Let's see what we can make of this verse. Not very long. I edidun auto esmernis menan oinan has deuk elaben. And they gave him myrrh mixed with wine, or wine mixed with myrrh. But he did not take, did not receive. This edidun is in the imperfect. I saw a couple sources that suggested this was a repeated action. And if that's right, this would read as they kept trying to give him this drink mixture, but he did not take it. Now this is in the aorist, so I'm not sure I would read too much into the imperfect here. I don't know. I don't know if we can know for sure. But regardless, some kind of past tense. And they gave him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And the New English Translation, the Net Bible, says, it is difficult to say for certain who gave Jesus this drink of wine mixed with myrrh. For example, the executioner. To which I wonder, do we have an executioner mentioned? Not as such. Or perhaps women from Jerusalem. Or I think the last specified they, please correct me if I'm wrong or if you see otherwise, but I think the soldiers are still the prevailing third person plural at this point. They brought Jesus, that would be the soldiers. Yeah, here's the soldier. Well, that's still they in Greek. They led him away, they mocked him. So we're at the soldiers or some delegation thereof. I don't think that's changed in terms of who they is. So I would default to that unless Mark is specifying otherwise, but it is possible with somebody else. The question is one of interpretation. What is this act of giving him this drink? And I don't address this at all in the handout, but the commentaries are helpful here. And any commentary, Greek focused or not, this will send you back to biblical references that talk about giving drink to the dying. The question really being, is this a drink to assuage his pain, or is it a drink that tastes terrible and it's part of treating him poorly? How you answer that will affect how you answer who the they is. I've, in translation, kind of left those questions aside, which is generally my practice in translation when there's an interpretive question like that. I think that question probably still should be answered or at least explored. But in translation, you're not answering. My goal is not to answer questions that the text doesn't answer. Because if Mark isn't answering it, I guess I just want to preserve that rather than err on the side of over certainty when that may not be what Mark meant. You may see it differently, and so this is worth some research here, I think. But my suggestion, as I say, is just keep it as they. France says the subject is not expressed. But since the subjects of the preceding and following verses are clearly the soldiers, that would be the more natural sense here too. That doesn't mean 100% it was them, but I think it's more likely them. That would be the default assumption, I would think. This is an interesting word. Let's look at it in context. Let's go back to just verse 23. Now, if you look at this word, you can see Smyrna. It's even down here in the instant details. So we've got Smyrniso. Well, first of all, we've got Esmernismenon, which is the perfect middle participle masculine singular accusative. So it's a participle from this verb smyrnizo, which is to murify, is what we would say. This itso would be to kind of do, it's almost like verbifying a subject in English. So if so dash ify, so it's like putting myrrh in. That's what this word means. And you could see this in BDAG or any other lexicon, to treat with myrrh, smyrnizo. And if you scrolled up, you'll find there's Smyrna, both the place name, but also myrrh itself. So it took me a little while to unpack this word, but it's all there in the root. So it's first it's Smyrna, then it's smyrnizo, and then it's the perfect participle. So that's why you end up getting such a long word with the myrrh root in there. So it's wine, oinon, mixed with myrrh. And that participle is what gives us the word mixed. So it's not just myrrh wine or wine myrrh, it's specifically because of this itso, which becomes ismenon in the participle. It's wine mixed with myrrh. I think it was in the UBS Translator's Handbook. I did not put this in your handout, but there's a question here. Myrrh is, of course, unknown in most parts of the world, thus necessitating a borrowed word, which may be identified satisfactorily in several ways. And then it gives some options here. You can say what myrrh is in your translation if you like, or you can just name it as myrrh and know that there is some explanation to happen somewhere else. Here's a fuller definition. So myrrh is the translation equivalent in BDAG. But we get the resinous gum of the bush Balsamodendron myrrha. That's what it is. This will be easy to find in research in terms of what it looks like. Again, you could right-click this word, go to research. You could even start with graphics tools and see if you get any captions, and sure enough, there it is. There's myrrh resin. Here's another one. Not something I would want to drink personally, but yeah, if you want to go further into detail, you could go to research and search all tools. France says Jesus's refusal of the offer is not explained. And it's just very short and simple. He didn't take it. He said no. And it's has deuk elabin. France says it has been linked with his determination since Gethsemane to drink the cup of suffering allotted to him in full measure. His desire to remain in possession of his senses rather than lapse into unconsciousness. So if it had this narcotic effect, he wants to kind of stay present. Or his pledge at the Passover meal not to drink wine again until he drank the new wine of the kingdom of God. Any or all of these may have played a part, but Mark does not say so. This is one reason I love this commentary so much, is that he explains possible options and then just reminds us. I mean, France, I think maybe more than any other commentator, really wants to stick with Mark. I mean, I think ideally every commentator would try to do that as best as they can, but France will explicitly bring out things like this often. So yes, we can wonder about this, and we should, and maybe there's some meaning here to uncover that we can get at, but in the end, we have what Mark gives us, which is that he did not take it. Comments or questions on verse 23? Yeah, here's, let me put this in the chat. So along similar lines, and someone had said this earlier, medical types have said this drink concoction is a stupefying, mind-numbing collection, and Jesus refused to show he chose to give life, not doing so in a drunken, Jesus' refusal shows that he was choosing to give life, not doing so in a drunken, out-of-mind action. Right. So wanting to retain his senses, you know, I think it sounds like you may be alluding to the idea of him giving his life willingly, and where he talks about that laying down his life for his friends. And this would, not taking this would kind of head off at the pass any objection that he wasn't in his right mind. So yeah, and I think that has a lot of explanatory power, personally. Any other comments or questions? Here, okay, great. Let me put this in the chat. Someone says the moment is being emphasized due to slow motion use of present tense. Kai edi dun auto in verse 23, and they give, actually that's imperfect. But we do have the present tense in verse right here. Nope, that's not it. Yeah, right here. And they lead him away in verse 20. Verse 24, present tense. Yep, that's right. Starusin. And here again. Yeah, so there's a great quote on that, and that's actually a perfect transition to the last verse. Let's look at it. I'll pick up that comment in just a moment, because we're about to head right there. Mark 15:24. Kai staurusin auton. So this is it. Sorry, that I probably should have had more fanfare. Verse 23, they gave him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And now this is it. Kai staurusin auton. I mean, this is a hugely significant moment. And we get these three words, Kai staurusin auton, and they crucify him. Kai diamerizantai ta hematia autu, balantes kleron epauta tis ti are. And or so then they crucify him, and they divide his clothing, casting, another present tense, lots, epauta, casting lots over his clothes, who would get what? Who would take them? All right, here's my translation. Then they crucified him and divided his clothes, casting lots for who would take them, for who would take his clothes. And yeah, here, staurusin, present active indicative, as in 20b and 21. Gundry, Stan Gundry, in his Mark commentary, says he thinks this historical present is to emphasize how this scene fulfills Jesus's prediction in Mark 10:33 through 34, which is, the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and experts in the law. That happened. They will condemn him to death. That happened. We'll turn him over to the Gentiles. Also happened. They will mock him, spit on him, flog him severely, and now here's where we are. They will kill him. And we have this awesome, awesome final part. Yet after 3 days, he will rise again. We're not there yet in the narrative, but look how far we are in this prediction. So whether he's right or not, Gundry is saying this historical present is meant to kind of bring this prediction front and center. You could also say that that present tense is just a rhetorical device to kind of put you right there in the action. I noted last week that Mark was jumping around a fair amount between aorist, imperfect, and present, even in the same scene. Some of that has to do, you know, scholars will talk about verbal aspect and more about standpoint than about tense per se. But even so, it wasn't consistent verse to verse. And I just kind of wondered aloud with you, is that because Mark is wanting to show this as that there's a certain timelessness to this event? I mean, there is theologically a once and for all-ness to this event. Hebrews will talk about that especially. But I also wonder too about the kind of, maybe it's too cosmic to talk about some kind of rupture in the space-time continuum, but it's such a cosmically significant event that I think that could explain the difference in present, aorist, and imperfect. We can wonder about it. The decision to make is how to translate it, and I would just encourage consistency. If you have said every time I see the historical present in Mark, I'm going to bring it over into English as present so that readers can get a sense of what it sounded like in Greek. If you say that, which is definitely an option in translation, I would just encourage consistency across. I mean, there's a lot of these in Mark, so I wouldn't only do it here. If you do it here, I would do it elsewhere. So if you did that, it would sound like then they, or now they crucify him, or so they crucify him, or and they crucify him and divide his clothes, and so on. That's the historical present. Let me just check in and see questions. Oh yeah, here's somebody, the over and over use with kai edi, dun auto, right. All right, so balantes kleron, throwing a lot. Now this doesn't mean a lot as in many times. It's well, here's BDAG, a specially marked object such as a pebble, a piece of pottery, or a stick used to decide something. So casting here for throwing is a good way to translate it. The Net Bible gives us throwing dice, which is interesting. That might be anachronistic. We'd have to confirm, did they have dice back then? And I don't know, what is there a Greek word for dice? If so, that's not what's used. Actually, I'm just curious about that. So the way to look at this would be go to English Gloss and see if you've got dice or even die, but that's going to be the verb die. Yeah, so that's a decision, and they explain that in their note. Let me just pull that up briefly. Yeah, according to Loneida, a term for dice is particularly appropriate. Yeah, modern equivalent was chosen here because of its association with gambling. So I think they're acknowledging that this might be anachronistic. But the idea here is that, yeah, they're choosing by lot, they're drawing lots, they gave them lots. This is saying it's probable. We're not talking about casting dice, but this is small sticks were handed out. You know, the phrase, you get the short end of the stick. And so they were basically kind of betting, not betting, but they were just leaving it to chance who was going to get what. Now, there's more there than comes out in translation. Well, a few things. For one, what does this say that this is where their focus is now? I mean, they've been intently focused on Jesus and shaming him and abusing him. And now that they crucify him, they're kind of off to something else, which is dividing his clothes. I mean, you could talk about how that's a violation of his dignity. You could also, it really importantly, notice here in the NA28, this is in italics, which means it's a quotation. Any of your cross-reference tools would have this. The NET Bible is likely to have it. An allusion to Psalm 22:18, and you can click that open and look at that. They divide my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots. Now, this I think you want to look at in context, and of course with the beginning of this psalm, my God, why have you forsaken me? This psalm is at play in the crucifixion narrative more than just this verse, but we do see this verse. I mean, this looks pretty word for word to me. You would want to go to the Septuagint and the Hebrew and compare, but in the NA28, we get this in italics. We get a cross-reference in the Net Bible. Any other Bible probably, or your study notes would have what this reference is. You could even try, I'm not going to belabor this, but just to search this phrase in the Septuagint, you might get there that way or not. You might have to be creative. Maybe the tense is a little bit different. But that's something to consider. So not only, and I wonder if this is what Gundry is after, not only is Jesus fulfilling this prophecy through this scene, there's also something from the Psalms that's coming out. So maybe the present has something to do with that as well. Just a final note, and then we'll move on, or we'll wrap up. Casting lots for who would take them. I'm not sure that's the best translation. I liked Strauss's suggestion, casting lots for them, for the clothes, to see who would get what. So if you, SIL Exegetical Summary Series will give you a good kind of left to right wooden-ish translation. Let me see what they've got here. For them to determine who would get what. Yeah, so the challenge here is you basically got words missing in Greek for it to make sense in English. So you might kind of sit with that and figure out the best way to word that. Yeah, casting lots, just a note about that. And so I'll close with this. Strauss notes that Mark uses only 3 words in Greek to describe their crucifying him. But Strauss quotes Cicero and Josephus to illustrate that crucifixion was viewed with horror, he says, by the writers of the day. So Cicero, the cruelest and most hideous punishment possible. Josephus, the most miserable of deaths. We might be surprised at this point in the narrative that we get these 3 words and that's it, at least so far, because we got a pretty detailed, I would say even an uncomfortably detailed description here of Jesus's abuse. And so now with the crucifixion, it's just these 3 words. We might wonder about that, but even as we scroll on, there may be more here. There's some crying out, that the pain is evident, but I just think that's interesting that for as many words as Mark used to describe the pre-crucifixion torture scene, it's a real economy of words here. So I don't know if we make anything of that or not. It's just interesting. And when Strauss pointed that out, it just sort of occurred to me as, oh yeah, you could have said a lot more about this, Mark, but you didn't. I think one reason for that is probably everybody knew what this involved, so you just didn't have to say much more. But so even in our translation is going to be, then they crucified him. And that's just really not much. I mean, I don't think it does justice to fully capture the horrors of this verb here. Now, in translation, do you want to bring out more of that or not? That's a question to consider always, I think, in this passage too. I think maybe the way forward is translated as crucified, maybe think about a study note or something explanatory along the lines of what's here. All right, let me stop there. We're at the top of the hour. I want to respect your time, but I'm happy to take any other comments or questions either on this last verse or on anything else that we've looked at in this passage. Oh yeah, here's I'll put this in the in your chat and read it. A final Q&A, much discussion on whether the following doesn't mean the entire cross. Hina Are Tanstaron Autu. Could he, Simon, carry or drag the entire cross? Yeah, that's a good question. I saw in, and I don't remember which commentary now, but something about just a portion or just the cross beam being carried, and how heavy would this thing be? Yeah, I think that would be worth some further study. I appreciate that question, and I've seen it addressed in a couple commentaries at least. So what is it exactly that's being carried? Now, if you go further and you conclude, well, it's just a portion of the cross or just the cross beam or you know, the top horizontal part, maybe you bring that out in translation. But I think at the least understanding it would be important. So thanks for that. Thanks so much for your great comments and questions as always. I'm going to end the recording and then stay on live for just a moment. If you are watching on recording, tinyurl.com/Mark translation notes, that takes you to a shared Google Drive folder where I've got this and all the other handouts, and my email address is there as well.